It is impossible to investigate all of these crimes. It is just impossible. Unless, of course, you want to be doing this for the next 50 years.
In these cases, it just looked like some political statement, not as a real tribunal who will trial Putin.
You undermine fair trial rights. You start to see people as guilty before the trial has begun.
Your wife will definitely divorce you in case you do that.
Mental state of that military commander and unit changed from one of subjugation, control, to one of destruction.
Who are these lawyers who agree to be on such a wrong side of the history?
I was a defense lawyer for 15 years at the international tribunals.
Actually, in one of the interviews when you were asked what is your motivation to keep working in Ukraine and to keep living in Ukraine actually during the wartime, you mentioned that for you it's some kind of a form of resistance during the time of Russian aggression, and at the same time you hope to see one day Putin on the dock in The Hague. Actually, you came to Ukraine around 10 years ago. You started to work with your organization Global Rights Compliance around 2015 here. Mm-hmm. If you were asked this question at that time, will the answer be different? Because I understand that many things changed. The perspective of seeing Putin on the dock is not so distant as it used to be at that time.
Mm-hmm. Well, in 2015, I guess my motivation was much more to provide some help, but I wasn't, I have to admit, invested in the result as I am now. I didn't know Ukraine. I'd never thought about living in Ukraine. In fact, I was living very happily in Paris, and I really didn't want to be anywhere but Paris at that point in time. And of course, the prosecutors and investigators who were working there were not interested either, particularly in investigating war crimes. So the job didn't feel very compelling, and the enthusiasm of the people I was helping didn't seem very big. So I wasn't motivated. Over the years, of course, I became more invested. I met my now wife, who's Ukrainian. I moved to Ukraine to live with her, and I became much more part of the country. It became my adopted country, so my interest in it succeeding in its democratic journey became much more a part of my work, and a part of that was getting accountability for the crimes being committed in Crimea and the crimes being committed in the Donbass. Of course, full-scale invasion changed all of that, and that transformed my enthusiasm to help the country into a real commitment, a real form of resistance, as you mentioned, that I couldn't go to the front line, I couldn't be a soldier, but I could do what I do, and I think I do it well, and I think I can really help the prosecution. I think my team has really helped the prosecution, and we're in it until the battle is over.
I noticed in your previous interviews that there are two questions that you asked the most frequently, and one of them is connected to this emotional aspect that you're the person who are attached to Ukraine because of your family, because of your life here, and at the same time you have to be somehow impartial in your work, prosecuting the war crimes. At the same time, we understand that there are another extreme thing when there are international lawyers or some teams of the prosecutors who are not so much attached to the country, and they are pretty often, like Amnesty International, been accused of lack of understanding the local context. For you being here, do you have the understanding which of these parts, or which of these ways is better? Which lawyer brings or prosecutor brings more benefit to the prosecution? Those who are less immersed into the context, or those who are more attached to this place?
That's a very good question, and there's no simple answer. What I would say is, first of all, it's impossible to do human rights work of this kind, investigating war crimes, investigating crimes against humanity, genocide, in any country without a good mix of local expertise and foreign expertise. It's just not effective. Domestic prosecutors here cannot do it themselves. I can't come here and do it without domestic experts. That's a very simple and minimum requirement alongside civil society. So you need three: civil society, domestic prosecutors, and foreign experts. That's the optimum. Now, the question of being invested in the culture or knowing something about the culture is of course an important one. And the more foreign experts can entrench themselves in that culture, the better, in my view. But there is a caveat to that, which is I think there are too many Ukrainian experts who beat foreigners with the stick of, you don't understand our culture. We are unique. Well,
it's very close to me because for the journalists, it's the same situation.
Same.
Like, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's a bit unfortunate because it pushes away people like me who really want to help and who, of course, will always have a deficit of knowledge about the culture. I've been living here 10 years, but I know a fraction of what Ukrainians know. So it's used to push foreigners away, and I think that's a bit unfortunate. I think this idea of exceptionality, you hear this amongst Americans. We're the most exceptional country in the world. I'm not sure it ever helps. It never helps to say we are exceptional. This circumstance is exceptional. This is unique. The war crimes here are, of course, in one view unique, but in another view, they're actually very similar to other places where I've worked. So I bring to the table the knowledge of 2 decades of working in this field. And there's very few parts of the war crimes here which I don't understand because I'm not Ukrainian. Now, I don't understand the Ukrainian legal culture. I don't understand the culture of many of the victims. I don't understand the witnesses in the way that Ukrainian professionals do. But I can do a very good job, I think, of investigating and prosecuting these crimes as long as I'm supported with Ukrainian colleagues. So if you hear a Ukrainian or anybody saying, he can't do the job because he's not Ukrainian, then I think it's them who have the problem, not myself. On the other hand, there are a lot of foreigners who come here who think that they know everything. And that's an equal problem.
So this mixture of the experiences is maybe more valuable here.
Well, without a doubt. I think you definitely need them. I mean, I'm tired, I have to say, of seeing foreigners come to this country and act as if they know everything. That's equally as tiresome as Ukrainians telling me that I can't do the job because I'm not Ukrainian.
Do you hear that pretty much? Or maybe
whispering
previously?
Quietly.
I see. Let's make a step back. And when you came with your work in 2015 to Ukraine, actually, we understand that Ukraine was in many terms a completely different country, and the background of the crimes was very different. Can you remember or maybe make some structure briefly of these crimes that you were working at that time? As far as I remember, for example, when Ukraine had an agreement with the ICC in 2014 or 2015, the ICC was also prosecuting not only the Russian crimes in Donbas or Crimea that were occupied, but also the crimes committed with what happened in Maidan. Were you somehow involved in this investigation as well, or what was your focus at that time?
Yeah, actually my focus was largely, or at least 50% of my time was on Euromaidan crimes, and I was supporting Hobachuk, who was the prosecutor then in charge of those crimes. The situation at that point was that, as you say, that Ukraine had filed 2 declarations which essentially gave the ICC jurisdiction to investigate crimes in Crimea and in the east and in Euromaidan. And the question for the Euromaidan crimes, well, there was a couple of questions. One was, do they amount to crimes against humanity? Because they were not war crimes, because there was no armed conflict at that point. Certainly not in Ukraine, in Kiev. And then secondly, they were not genocide. So the only possibility in terms of the ICC being able to investigate them was that if they amounted to crimes against humanity. So that was the big question, and that's what I was helping the prosecution with. And the question for that was, crimes against humanity require acts committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack on a civilian population. So the question was whether the actions of Yanukovych's government around the country amounted to a widespread or systematic attack on the civilian population. And the ICC prosecutor doubted that. And so I was trying to help the prosecution to demonstrate that. But we were also helping...
And you believed that it was the crimes against humanity?
I think they looked like it was a systematic attack on a civilian population. So you need widespread or systematic. Widespread is a frequent number of crimes, and systematic is that you have a repetitive, the repetitive nature of the crimes.
Some pattern of this crime.
Exactly, and that must emanate or come from a plan from the government. So I doubted whether they were widespread enough. But systematic, I didn't have much doubt that they were systematic. They were done by a plan from the government, and the government poured resources into trying to quell the protests. And in the end, it seemed to me that they did everything they could to brutalize the civilian protesters. And so that looked to me like it was systematic.
You mentioned many times that these crimes that you see, for example, in Crimea and Donbass, these patterns of the Russian crimes that you saw at that time, they were repeating itself in 2022, but since 2022, but in a much more large-scale thing. At the same time, can you say that you're a person of a vast experience in working in different tribunals for Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and other former Yugoslavia, if I'm not mistaken, right? So actually, in 2022, were there some things that were striking even for you? You've seen so much. You've talked to many people who were accused of committing the serious international crimes. Were there any things that you were impressed by committed by Russians?
You know, I think the first few months, to me, it appeared like it resembled some of the other conflicts, like the former Yugoslavia, in the sense that there was military activity and then there was very badly behaved Russian soldiers. And so it looked like there was a military attack and then incidental crimes which arose through indisciplined troops. However, I think after a few months it became clear to me that it wasn't that at all. In fact, the military attack was supposed to involve crimes. And I think that was a bit shocking to me because it was much more cynical than I'd seen for a long time, in the sense that whatever's happened since the full-scale invasion, wherever the military have been operating, I think there's one thing that binds all of that together, which is that will be no surprise to your viewers. The one thing that binds it all together is that Russia wants to extinguish Ukrainian identity. Now that is really a quite unusual, I think, objective, and it cannot be achieved without the mass commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity and maybe genocide. So it's not that crimes are incidental to the military operation, it's that the military operation is inherently criminal. Now in Yugoslavia, for example, much of the military activity was ordinary military activity, not unlawful. There were unlawful aspects to it because crimes arose from that lawful military activity.
But if you're talking about some rules of waging the war?
There were some rules being followed, and the idea was to push the opponents from that, the military, to take over towns belonging to the Croatians, to take over towns belonging to the Muslims, to take over towns belonging to the Serbs. That was not the aim of the Russian military. It's the Russian military's aim is to take over the towns and then force the population to be Russian. How do you do that with a population which wants to be Ukrainian? Well, you do that through massive commission of international crimes. And I think I couldn't work out at the beginning from the full-scale invasion, despite the fact I'd followed the conflict, despite the fact I understood something about the Russian politics. I couldn't understand certain aspects of the conflict. Why, for example, they were transferring children into Russia.
And keep doing it.
Why did they seem to be under the illusion that they were going to be welcomed? And there were certain features of the conflict which puzzled me until I put it all together, and I was like, that's what it is. It's about extinguishing identity. And I haven't seen that in another. It's a sort of military campaign from yesteryear, from 100 years ago, 200 years ago, where you take over your opponents and you subjugate them, and they become your slaves and they become second-class citizens, and that is not something I think which you see in modern conflicts very often.
We'll definitely talk about this attempts to destroy the Ukrainian identity as a part of possible crime of genocide that is happening but not visible by the International Criminal Court yet here in Ukraine. But still, let's talk about you mentioned this evolution of the Russian crimes. I'm not a lawyer, but for me it's maybe easier to to divide these different Russian crimes into two parts. Like the first one is what they are doing on the occupied territories, occupied until 2022 and after, when they try to gain power and to make sure that everyone is in their control. And the other part is the crimes that are committed on the rest of the territory of Ukraine, like the shelling of the energetic infrastructure, any other civilian infrastructure. Generally, from your point of view, in which of these types of crimes, in which of its tactics Russians managed to evolve the most? They became more cunning, more cruel maybe. Do you really observe that there is some change in their behavior?
In the first phase, I think the bombing of civilian infrastructure was done in order to frighten the population into not resisting, so that the towns could be overtaken. Bodianka is a good example. I know I pronounced that badly, but they bombed residential buildings and then they move in rapidly to take it over. So the missile attacks, from what I can see, were a means of subduing the population so that they could take over the towns more easily and then move to Kiev. I think that changed once. And of course, at that point, they were anticipating not that much resistance. And so, in fact, they may even been anticipating enthusiasm for a Russian takeover, which seems almost implausible when you know anything about Ukrainians. But anyway, I think there was at least on some level some delusion about that. And so it wasn't necessarily anticipated that there wouldn't necessarily need to be that much criminal activity. You get hold of the government, you kill them, you get hold of local politicians, you get hold of the troublemakers and you detain them, you torture them, you kill them. I'm saying that as if it's nothing, but of course it's a lot. But not compared to what in fact happened subsequently when they arrived, realized there was huge resistance, and then therefore their concept of what criminal behavior was needed grew. So they realized they were facing a determined population who didn't want them, and therefore they would need to expand their criminal plan to persecute and subdue, brutalize not just the military, not just the security services, not just the local politicians, but ordinary civilians. And then, of course, when they were pushed back from Kiev, and then there was the Ukrainian counteroffensives, the successful ones in Kharkiv and Kherson, I think that's when the missile attacks began of a different kind. And at that point, that they became about punishing the civilian population, and not just about subduing them. That we're going to make you freeze to death in the winter. And it became about destruction for destruction's sake, almost like revenge. You don't want us. And this is where the question of genocide, we can come back to this, but this is where the question of genocide arises in my mind, is we're going to take it over, we're going to import Russian identity, extinguish Ukrainian identity, and at the point when you show resistance to that, we will, if necessary, destroy those aspects of Ukrainian society or Ukrainian population necessary to achieve our aims. So I think I would look at it in two phases. One is the first phase where they still had hope that the population might be, if not friendly, at least
loyal,
more easily made loyal by virtue of fear. And then it moved into a different phase where they understood Ukrainians were going to resist. And at that point it became much more, I think, about punishment and revenge and persecution in order to achieve military aims. I think on some level they still believe that if they keep bombing the electricity infrastructure, that Ukrainians will go, oh, we've had enough and we don't want to fight anymore. I mean, it seems almost ridiculous. But they keep doing it. So you're left with the idea that, well, it must be about that. Then what else could it be about?
But this aspect of fear that you mentioned in the very beginning, actually it seems to me it's relevant until now, because sometimes if we are talking about bombing some, for example, in Kiev, like at least several times a month we see some Russian attacks, and usually they are targeting not so much military infrastructure, but more generally civil infrastructure, civilian buildings that suffer from the shelling. And we see like 1, 2, 3, 5 people die. So not a huge amount of people. It sounds cynically, but still. But it sounds like an actual terrorism. So they try to keep people in this fear, but they are not reaching any military goals here. So it's just not fully understandable for me why to do that.
The intent to hit a civilian building is the important question. The motive, why you're doing it, in terms of, some crazy person in the Kremlin deciding that, that's a good idea, it becomes not very relevant. And that's true of all international crimes, because, the question of why dictators and autocrats and political and military leaders commit crimes to achieve certain aims, which are both criminal and political. The political aim becomes much less important. That's the motive. The criminal aim is what's important. So we could spend days discussing why Putin is doing these things, and many of them seem irrational and illogical, and almost certainly are irrational and illogical. But the question for if you're investigating these crimes is, don't get too distracted by that. Focus on the fact that every night he's trying to kill civilians, maybe only few in Kiev, or maybe more, we don't know. The air defense system works very effectively. And that's where his criminal intent, that's where his criminal responsibility arises.
Yeah, well, if even international lawyers are disappointed in the logic of the Russian attacks, it says much about them. Actually, let's take a closer look to your current work with the global rights compliance. You mentioned that your main task is now the cooperation of the Ukrainian law enforcement agencies and help them to document and prosecute the crimes. Actually, I've got 2 questions here. First of all, how do you see the dynamic of the capacities of the law enforcement here in Ukraine over the recent years? As far as I understand, over the 10 years that you work here, it changed completely. The international aid is also very much of a different scale that it used to be. And at the same time, what are these needs of help that they demand from you right now, or they feel the need in, or are they changing from the situation to situation, from crime to crime?
My organization, Global Rights Compliance, is part of a larger organization called the Atrocities Crimes Advisory Group, which is funded by the EU, the UK and the US. At the moment, not the US, unfortunately. And that contains five organizations, including the EU mission, including Justice Pravdo, IDLO, and Georgetown University. And we're all trying to coordinate our support for the prosecution and for the police and for the state security services. And these 3 are the principal entities responsible for investigating and prosecuting war crimes. My part of it, or global rights compliance part of it, is we set up mobile teams. Now, I knew from my experience from 2015 to 2022 that what was needed was help on the ground. So I was back in the country. I left for a month after February 24th, and I came back as soon as I could. As soon as the Russians were pushed back from Kiev, I was back helping them to investigate in Bucha and Irpin and the other areas around Kiev. And the idea was we would be on the ground, we would be a proper resource to monitor what was happening in terms of the investigations and to help to mentor on various aspects of the investigation. I mean, this is the starting point in a way for our work is the realization or the truth that in order to investigate and prosecute these crimes, it's really complicated if you've never done it before. The reason it's really complicated is kind of obvious, especially in Ukraine where the crimes are massive. I mean, as big, former Yugoslavia, the crimes there, compared to the volume of crimes here and the different types of crimes being committed here, that was a much more straightforward conflict to work on. So you have a huge range of crimes, you have a huge volume of them, and you have a huge number, therefore, of moving parts from how do you interview a witness of a victim of rape? How do you assess a crater as to what kind of weapon was used? How do you assess the fragments of the missile? How do you determine whether that was an attack on a civilian target or in fact was an attack on a military target which went wrong, which was disproportionate? I mean, the number of humanitarian law principles which need to be taken into account. I mean, it's really an extraordinarily complex endeavour to try to investigate and prosecute crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity anywhere, and it's particularly difficult here. So most of the prosecutors, most of the investigators have never done anything like this before, and so the capacities were pretty low, I would say. The commitment was very definitely there, not before 2022, but at the point of 2022, the commitment changed completely. I rarely meet a prosecutor who's not completely committed to the job now, especially the regional prosecutors, who I think do an amazing job in very difficult circumstances. One of the biggest problems here is resources. The number of prosecutors working on war crimes is incredibly low. And the number of state security service, the number of police working is incredibly low. Prosecution have set up 9 regional subunits who specialise in investigating war crimes, where most of the war crimes have occurred. And in most of those, from Zaporizhia, Mykolaiv, Donetsk, Luhansk, and in most of these 9, you get less than 7 or 8 prosecutors, similar number of police, a similar number of state security service. It is almost impossible to investigate these crimes with that few number. But they work tirelessly. I mean, literally, they all look exhausted. They look as though they need a holiday for several years. And our job really is to provide, and this is why I wanted to set up the mobile teams, is because we are the only team who travel to the regions on a weekly basis, analyse what's being done, provide ongoing, consistent advice on what that case file contains, what you need to do to ensure that you have a good notice of suspicion which will withstand scrutiny, legal advice on what the elements of crimes are, legal advice on how you build complex cases against commanders. And it's worthwhile saying something about that, because most of the prosecutors, most of the investigators can investigate crimes that are occurring on the ground. The man who gets tortured in the basement, the woman who gets raped in her house, these are all crimes which look very much like ordinary crimes. So, of course, the prosecutors and investigators have experience doing that. Well, ordinary for a prosecutor and investigator, yeah. I mean, not extraordinary in many other ways. But the difficulty of investigating and prosecuting these crimes is not at that level. The difficulty is actually, how do you build a case against the Putins of this world, the Shogus of this world? That is extraordinarily complex, because you need to go from the ground through many links up the chain of command. Some of the chain of command being formal, some of the chain of command being informal. So it's an incredibly complicated job. And if you've never done it before, if you've only ever done cases which involve 4 or 5 suspects maximum, you're suddenly faced with cases which involve hundreds of suspects, and you need to investigate those hundreds before you get to the top military and political command in Russia. You need help. That's what our job is, basically, to help that process of going up the chain of command.
You mentioned about the motivation, and I thought here that maybe it's also very much connected to the demand of the publics of the justice, because actually we see that the amount of victims also is huge in Ukraine. Those who lost their loved ones, those who lost their colleagues, relatives, so who lost their houses. So generally the demand for this justice is also super high.
It is super high, and I think prosecutors are really aware of the public opinion.
Pressure maybe in some cases, yeah.
I think what could be done a bit better is explaining to the public what is actually happening and what is actually possible. Because, maybe because I'm a foreigner, I can say this, but it is impossible to investigate all of these crimes. It is just impossible. No system could do it. No prosperous or poor country can investigate all of these crimes. It's simply, unless, of course, you want to be doing this for the next 50 years. And I would advise against that, because at some point Ukraine needs closure. When I say closure, I don't mean forgiveness of the crimes. I mean closure for its own sake, to rebuild its own...
some satisfaction for the victims.
Exactly. And to understand that satisfaction for the victims doesn't have to depend just on criminal trials. I mean, I say this as an international criminal lawyer, but that's not the only solution, and it cannot be the only solution, because you cannot... Well, number one, you're not going to get all the suspects. They're going to hide away in Russia for the rest of their lives. Number two, just from a practical perspective, you can't have thousands, tens of thousands of trials. It's just impossible. There are other forms of justice which victims often want also. Not every victim wants a trial. Some victims want their house repairing, want a job, want psychosocial support, want some truth rather than necessarily a trial process. So that, I think, is a discussion which needs to happen in Ukrainian society. Maybe it's too early to be having that, but I'm not sure it's ever too early to have that conversation. I think it's good to have it as soon as possible, and not to give the impression that there is going to be a trial process for every single suspect.
From documenting and prosecuting the crimes, let's transfer a little bit to the court proceedings. And actually, the second most frequently asked question to you is about your previous experience as the defense attorney for the people who were accused in a really serious international crimes. The example that you reminds pretty often is about Issus from the court of Sierra Leone, who was sentenced to 52 years in prison. Talking about this background, can you explain the basic things, because they will definitely be needed to understand for Ukrainians when there will be some courts, international courts over the Russians. How is this defense team of the accused person is built actually? Who are these lawyers who agree to be on such a different side, wrong side of the history, and to defend these people? And what are the special skills that this lawyer need to have to become the part of this team?
Yeah, I mean, I was a defense lawyer for 15 years at the international tribunals. In some ways, that's how my international career started. And what kind of people do that? When I started, the reason I started doing that was I was a defense lawyer in the UK first. And then when I started at the international tribunals, it was very difficult for accused to have a fair trial. Very difficult. There was all the focus on the prosecution. There was no developed notion of fair trial rights for accused, and of course, everybody, if you're a member of the Rwandan government during the genocide, everybody thought you were guilty, including the judges.
So it's like some political pressure that is fueled on the courts.
Yeah, huge political pressure on the courts. A lot of money being spent, a lot of political capital being spent on setting up international courts for Rwanda, former Yugoslavia, then the Special Court for Sierra Leone, which you mentioned. And so success didn't mean everybody being acquitted. Success meant as many people as possible being convicted, and that means you undermine fair trial rights. You start to see people as guilty before the trial has begun, and the presumption of innocence then becomes just a theoretical idea and not a practical starting point, and a practical principle which should govern the whole way the trial runs. So being a defense lawyer felt very much like being a human rights activist, that you're trying to ensure fairness of trials. And I still think that's true. I mean, I think the defense rights have become much stronger at the International Criminal Court, and they've become much stronger over time in all of the international courts. But nonetheless, I think the role of a defense lawyer is as critical as the role of a prosecutor. Nobody sensibly wants to see anybody put on trial without a proper defense lawyer. Or else, why are we bothering with trials? Why don't we just say, we know what happened, we know you're guilty, you're going to prison for the rest of your life? Why would you want to do that? And of course, a fair trial is built into the Geneva Conventions and international law as a fundamental principle. Common Article 3, common to all the Geneva Conventions, includes the requirement of a fair trial for anyone tried as a consequence of being connected to an armed conflict. You know, when I was a defense lawyer, it horrified me to see people who, yes, they were once powerful, yes, they may be guilty of terrible things, being treated as if they were second-class humans. That, to me, offends me to my core of my human rights being, that as soon as you have power over an individual, you're able to abuse that power. That, to me, is the heart of the problem that we're all supposed to be dealing with. And I saw that far too often. I saw that with Issa Sese in Sierra Leone, who was abused by that court process and given a 52-year sentence when there was very little evidence to convict him, and even less evidence to give him a 52-year sentence. So, you know, I think abuse doesn't always come from those who look evil. It can sometimes come from those who are in positions of power, supposed to be doing good things. And that's true of some of these international judges, and it's certainly true of some of these international prosecutors. So that was my motivation for being a defense lawyer. And I think that's many of the motivations of defense lawyers, is that they understand that it's a difficult job to do. It's much easier being a prosecutor, I have to say. You know, you don't face the hostility that you face as a defense lawyer. It's much easier in that sense. Courts will listen to you when you're on the right side. So, I mean, I have to say now I've given up being a defense lawyer. I think, having said all of that...
Is it for you some moral choice, especially when you live in Ukraine and you just can't morally stand on the side of Putin and the Russian leadership? You mentioned in one of the interviews that your wife will definitely divorce you in case you do that.
Well, that's definitely true, without a shadow of a doubt. But also, that goes to your question earlier on about emotion. There's no chance I could represent a Russian accused such as Putin, because I feel too much anger, too much bitterness at what they've done. And so that's not a good place to start if you're going to represent somebody. But also my days as a defense lawyer are pretty much over, because I think, you know, there's so much violence, so many international crimes being committed around the world, and so many victims. I just think that whatever talents I have or don't have, I'd rather spend the rest of my life trying to help them directly, rather than help the process through being a defense lawyer. So, yeah, I think it's a noble profession, I think, to be a defense lawyer, but it's no longer one for me.
So as far as I understand, if we're talking about the future international courts over the Russians, so as far as I imagine it, the defense attorneys for the accused ones will be people from some third country, not from Ukraine, not for Russia, if you're taking this emotional component. What made me think about it is exactly, I remember that in 2022, I was covering the MH17 final court proceeding, and I talked to the Dutch lawyers of Oleg Pulatov, who was acquitted finally in this court, and actually what struck me at that time that they seemed to be inseparable from their work. I mean, on the one hand, they are professional lawyers. They made the case till the end, and the accused one was acquitted. But at the same time, when we are talking about generally the context of the Russian-Ukrainian war, they were very much unsure how to call the war. And they didn't call what was happening in Ukraine since 2014 the war. They were uncertain to call it a conflict, a war, some military conflict. So it seems to me it's very interesting generally to understand who will be these people who will be defending. We are talking not only about Putin, but another Russian leadership members.
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason why they couldn't be Russian. Often, I think, accused pick lawyers from their own country because they speak the same language and they come from the same culture.
So it's a normal thing.
It's normal. It's normal. Yeah. I mean, in most cases that I've done as a defense lawyer, we had in the team in Sierra Leone, we had a senior Sierra Leonean who was my co-counsel. So it's normal for the same reasons as I mentioned at the beginning, which is in order to investigate and prosecute these cases, you need a mixture of local expertise and international expertise, and the same is for defense. You need that mixture. That's going to give you the best recipe for success. You're human as a defense lawyer, right? I mean, I would say that I became friends with a couple of my old clients because, with Issa Sese, for example, I was doing that case for 6 years. I spent more time with him than I spent with almost any other person on the planet. And I liked him. And we got on well. Of course, the person you see as a defense lawyer is different to maybe what they were like before. Or maybe they're the same. You just don't know. But what you're seeing is a person whose power has been completely removed, who is in a very different position. You're his friend because you're his lawyer. So you have a different type of relationship than you would in the field. On the other hand, what you say about the lawyers in MH17, you ought not to let that cloud your judgment so that you are suddenly, I don't think with any of my clients, buy into their more exaggerated theories of what they say happened. My job as a defense lawyer is actually to try to see through that, because it's not going to help them to go to court. And for example, accused in Rwanda, many of the accused were Hutu extremists who refused to accept that there'd been a genocide. That is a ridiculous proposition to go to a court which clearly there has been a genocide, clearly it's been proven in many cases. You go to court and argue it's not. Don't be surprised if you lose your trial. So
you can't object the obvious things at the same time you get attached and you have to defend your client.
Yeah, and I think one of your jobs as a defense lawyer is to persuade your client not to be extreme in their defense, is to put forward reasonable arguments about what happened and about what their role was in going to court and arguing unreasonable things. You are not going to get the result that you want. So your job is to, if necessary, fall out with your client. There's always periods when you're representing these clients over years where you are not in a good state of mind with your client because they're wanting to put things forward to the court are really bad, and you're in charge of the strategy, they're in charge of the facts. You need to come to a compromise on how you're going to do this, and you can't compromise with somebody who's putting forward ridiculous facts which are not true and which that nobody is going to accept as true.
Actually, we're discussing this future trials of the Russians and their defense attorneys. Actually, I just thought that it's a so far-fetched perspective because, as for now, Russians they just don't confess any actions of the International Criminal Court, any other court that may be created and will trial Russians. Like, for example, these discussions around the Special Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression. So, actually, it will be definitely some new level of discussion of the judicial process for Russians.
But without a doubt, I mean, imagine if Putin is in the dock on the new tribunal or the ICC, let's say the crime of aggression tribunal, he's going to argue, because he doesn't have many arguments to put forward there, his argument's going to be that Ukraine was committing genocide in the Donbass. Completely implausible, ridiculous, and easily demonstrated to be nonsense. But he hasn't got many other options, right? If he's going to argue that the use of force in invading Ukraine was in line with the UN Charter, he's got two options. One, it was authorized by the Security Council, which we know is not true. Two, it was lawful self-defense. And I was defending, this is Putin, I was defending ethnic Russians in the Donbass who were victims of genocide. It's not a very plausible defense. And so,
at the same time, we have the statement of the International Court of Justice, who said that Russia is using the term of genocide not correctly. So.
Absolutely, yeah. And without, I mean, all the evidence is against him. Yeah. So what I would expect him to do, if he's ever in the dock, is he would do what some of the high-ranking accused do, which is to play a political card, because he hasn't got a legal card to play. So he would insist on representing himself so he could make political speeches. He would appoint a team which was entirely political and run a very political defense, which had nothing to do with the charges. This is what I mentioned earlier, the difference between intent and motive. He would be playing on the motive, and the rest of the court would be playing on the criminal intent. That's what I would anticipate with someone like him. If you don't have anywhere to go but political, then you go political.
By the way, concerning this international tribunal for the crime of aggression, now over 3 years, Ukraine has been discussing how to create it. We have now a core group of more than 40 countries who is now creating this tribunal. On the last meeting of the core group, there was some progress, and it was already established that this tribunal will be on the basis of the agreement between Ukraine and the Council of Europe. From your point of view, generally, this format of tribunal, is it acceptable? Does it give much freedom, let's say, to Ukraine to prosecute Putin and Russian leadership? Because we still, as far as I understand, don't have the answer to the key questions, like, for example, what's going to happen to the immunity of the so-called Troika, the President, Prime Minister, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So if you follow this topic, what do you think about this process?
Well, I think it's been a bit disappointing, I think, from the highs of 2022 when an international tribunal looked possible, and an international tribunal is necessary if you're going to pierce the immunity of the Troika. When 2022 came, I was against the idea of a tribunal.
Why?
I think largely because of the bruising experience I'd had as a defense lawyer at the international tribunals, where I'd seen such politicized justice. And I thought, okay, what's going to happen? We'll have politicized justice. The judges already convict before the process begins. And two, there's going to be lots of jobs for lots of foreign lawyers to get rich. And so I thought, it's not a good idea. And then I began to understand how important it was for Ukrainians. And I also thought, well, if you don't have a tribunal for the crime of aggression in this kind of case, when do you have it? I mean, there couldn't be a clearer case of it, a more black and white situation. So I changed my mind. And then I came to the view that a tribunal of any kind was better than none, even if it couldn't pierce the immunity of the Troika, which is where we are now. This is 40 countries supporting a tribunal which is set up by the Council of Europe in the agreement between the Council of Europe and Ukraine. That is not going to be an international tribunal, as far as I can see. I mean, don't hold me to that, never say never, but it looks very unlikely that will have enough features of international consensus, international law to pierce the Troika. But
in these cases, it just looked like some political statement, not as a real tribunal who will try Putin.
I think it won't try Putin, but I don't think it's necessarily a political statement. It depends who else then becomes a target, because crime of aggression is a leadership crime, and so it's not just Lavrov, and it's not just Putin, and it's not just the prime minister. It's also the Shoigus, the Gerasimov, FSB. anyone who's in a leadership position who's been responsible for planning and executing the crime of aggression can be a suspect in that tribunal. So, of course, there's a political aspect to it, but it can also do some proper criminal adjudication. The bigger problem is, of course, getting hold of those people, whether Putin or anyone else. And that's the bigger risk, that it becomes a tribunal, a theatre without the main actors, like staging Hamlet, but without Hamlet. That's the problem, because then it does veer into being more a political statement than it is a criminal process, and that's problematic in my view.
It seems to me you mentioned like the most important link in this chain that is lacking right now, the understanding how actually Putin is going to appear in Hague, whatever in the ICC or in the International Tribunal, if it will be established finally. Actually, do you have any answers, any scenarios to that? Because I know that there are many optimistic examples, like for example, Slobodan Milosevic really appeared in the tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, but there are another political conditions for that.
Yeah. Well, I have to say I was more optimistic 2 or 3 years ago, I have to say. 2 years ago, because I think maybe all of us have been surprised at how the Russian population have consolidated around the Putin regime. And maybe not everybody's surprised, but I think a lot of people, Ukrainians I knew, were at least hopeful that there could be some kind of revolution within Russia, and that the war would become unpopular, and therefore so would Putin. And as we can see, that hasn't happened. But until we have that, Putin is secure in Russia, and he won't travel to any country which would be prepared to arrest him. And so the prospects of getting hold of him are as low now as they've been at any point since the full-scale invasion, I would have thought. But who knows in 10 years, who knows in 15 years, if he's still alive. But I think it would be a bit overly optimistic to think in the short term or even in the mid-term.
I see. We discussed this aspect of the political will of the countries that plays a role for establishing the tribunal for try Putin for the crime of aggression. We also mentioned the ICC arrest warrants there are 6 arrest warrants for Putin and another Russian leaders and military leaders for the war crimes and crimes against humanity. But let's take a closer look to the crime of genocide. We see that stubbornly international organizations, ICC, don't see enough evidence. The United Nations also commissioned here in Ukraine don't see any evidence of genocide.
I think what's happened here is, I believe that there has been genocide. I think some of the military have committed genocide. And the reason I think that they have is because, not that I think the original plan was genocidal, which is what a lot of Ukrainians, I think, thought it was at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. I didn't think that. I thought it was, and I still think the original plan was and remains to extinguish Ukrainian identity and to replace it with Russian identity and to subjugate and subdue the population under Russian rule. But I think what happened here is why I think that genocide has occurred is because I think that original plan didn't work. The original plan to subdue, yes, it worked in some places. Those that have been under occupation for a long time undoubtedly are having a terrible time and been persecuted and having their Ukrainian identity extinguished through forced passportization, through removing Ukrainian curriculum and so on, stealing of cultural artifacts, the list goes on.
But stealing Ukrainian children.
Stealing Ukrainian children. But I think that what happens is that in some places when that plan doesn't work, the plan becomes more destructive. Genocide, as defined by the Genocide Convention, is the physical destruction of a part of or all of the group here being the Ukrainian nation, or the Ukrainian political group. And I think that the Russian plan turns destructive when it doesn't succeed in extinguishing Ukrainian identity. And I think you see that in places from Bucha to Kharkiv to Kherson. And I think therein lies the genocide, the destructive violence that you see in certain areas which arose at the point when the resistance against their occupation became most acute is a testament to that, I think. But of course, that's very difficult to investigate because you have to investigate the patterns. You can't just go to Bucha and investigate Bucha and go, see, you got genocide there. You have to show that there was a plan, and the plan then changed in these given moments, and the mental state of that military commander and unit changed from one of subjugation, control, to one of destruction. So, but as I say, I think that can be demonstrated, but I think there's no point rushing to try to demonstrate that. Work through the war crimes, work through the crimes against humanity, which are absolutely obvious to anybody, and see where you end up in terms of the intent. That's the purpose and intent initially is to subdue. If that fails, the question is, did it turn into we're going to I always use this example, and it sounds a bit flippant, but like the man who kills his wife and his kids because he says, well, if I can't have you, then no one will have you. That to me is where the genocidal campaign in Ukraine is. If you don't want us, we'll kill you instead then. We'll destroy you instead.
Wow. But do you have the understanding what arguments will be enough, for example, for the ICC to prosecute it? Because some obvious things for you as a lawyer working here and for the Ukrainian nation generally who suppose that they may have supposed that there happened a genocide, it's not the same that the legislation background that the ICC needs.
Well, I mean, the bigger problem for the ICC is not the definition and not the because what I'm putting forward is in line with the standard definition of genocide, and that I'm looking through that lens. The bigger problem is, and the ICC will not prosecute genocide in Ukraine. I think that's the reality, because it's too, for the reasons I've just stated, it's too challenging without certain prospects. If you get Putin in front of the court for child abduction, he's getting convicted, no doubt about it, because he's on video confessing to, he's signing presidential decrees. It's happening in the field and can be demonstrated. The plan is clear. His involvement is clear. Ditto with the commanders charged with attacks on critical infrastructure. The patterns of crimes are clear. There's no viable defense. Genocide, you would need a much better resourced International Criminal Court prosecution, and it's practically on its knees with trying to investigate different situations around the world, from Myanmar to Israel, Palestine to Ukraine.
Oh, here we see the political pressure and political background pretty much.
Without a doubt. So, I mean, the last thing that Karim Khan, the prosecutor, needs is a more difficult case to prosecute from Ukraine. Then he's already got good cases. I'm hoping that he still goes against Putin for the military operation as a whole. And again, it's much simpler to get him for war crimes and crimes against humanity, and he would go to prison for the rest of his life anyway. So why, if you're him, would you do the next step of putting yourself in a situation of having to prove genocide? Now, you mentioned the Commission of Inquiry. I think we have to understand that the Commission of Inquiry is a limited investigative entity. They too, if they want to investigate genocide, they will need to pour resources into this and spend 2 years investigating it. They are barely
to focus completely on
to focus on it, because they're barely able to investigate crimes against humanity. They are really great judges, I know these judges. Judge Mose, who's the presiding judge, is a fantastic jurist, very committed, very honest, very skillful. But there's 3 or 4 judges, and they've got 1 or 2 or 3 investigators operating full time. So the idea that they can investigate the whole conflict and find the pockets of genocide, it's just not going to happen. You know, genocide becomes just impossible in this situation. If it was Rwanda, where it's all about genocide,
and it's crystal clear how it happened.
It's mass killing, and nothing else is happening other than mass killing and mass sexual violence. Here, you've got, this is what I said at the beginning about the complex. This is really complicated. It's got a mixture of crimes against humanity, a mixture of war crimes of a huge number of variety, plus, I would argue, pockets of genocide. That's a big investigative job.
The final questions I ask all of the lawyers I talk to here is what role maybe in the Putin's or trial over any other representatives of the Russian leadership you would like to play? I mean, do you imagine yourself in a court over Putin, or which part of this mosaic of the crimes that we've discussed here you would like to actively participate in court?
Oh, I mean, if Putin was in a court, I would be very happy to be lead prosecutor.
Oh.
Very happy to do that. And I would make sure he had a fair trial, because I would want no doubt left when he is convicted that he's had every opportunity to defend himself, even though he's provided no such privilege to Ukrainians. And I would want that judgment to stand as something which stands the test of time. I avoid the courtroom often these days, but I would be happy to put myself back in the courtroom for that.
I wish you and all of us of the fulfillment of this dream.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. It was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.